Good evening and welcome to Mandel Hall at the University of Chicago. My name is Solveig Nelson. I'm the events coordinator at 57th Street Books and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. This event is sponsored by 57th Street Books and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. I would like to thank Bob James, the director of Mandel Hall, Michael Dawson, and Evelyn Tennant for all of their work on this event. I have a few brief comments about the procedure. During the question and answer period, we ask that people with questions line up behind the microphone on the stage right aisle. Those who wish to have books signed should line up in the same place after the Q&A. Lastly, we ask that you refrain from taking photographs until the question and answer period. At this time, I would like to introduce the moderator for this evening's discussion, Professor Michael Dawson. Mr. Dawson is the chair of the Political Science Department and director of the Center of the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture at the University of Chicago. One of the country's leading researchers on race and public opinion, Mr. Dawson is the author of Black Visions, forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press, and Behind the Mule, Race and Class in African American Politics. Please welcome Michael Dawson.
Thank you very much. We're very happy to be here today. This is a continuation of our partnership with 57th Street Books and attempts by the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture to have a lively discussion on the future of this nation and indeed to have a discussion of the global consequences of racial, ethnic, and democratic politics. My job today is quite easy. Essentially, it's to roll the ball out and to have my distinguished colleagues talk about subjects to which they have contributed immensely over the past decades. I've also been instructed, much against my will, to keep the introductions short. Professor Cass Sunstein is Carl N. Llewellyn Distinguished Service Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Chicago Law School and is my colleague in the Department of Political Science. He is author, among many other works, of One Case at a Time, forthcoming from Harvard, The Cost of Rights with Stephen Holmes, forthcoming from Norton, Clones and Clones, Facts and Fantasies About Human Cloning, edited with Martha Nussbaum. Professor Sunstein has participated in law reform and constitution-making efforts in South Africa, China, Bosnia, Ukraine, and Russia. He has frequently testified, before Congress on issues of constitutional law and regulation policy, and recently Mr. Sunstein has been involved in discussions in Congress regarding impeachment. Professor West is currently Professor of Religion and Afro-American Studies at Harvard University. He is author of Restoring Hope, Conversations on the Future of Black America. He is co-author of The War Against Parents with Sylvia Hewlett, and of course he is author of numerous other works such as Race Matters, Youth and Blacks, A Dialogue on Race, Religion, and Culture in America with Michael Lerner, Keeping Faith, Philosophy, and Race in America, is a partner in crime with Bell Hooks in a number of fascinating conversations, which appeared in part in Breaking Bad. Professor West has been deeply concerned with the nature of democracy and the practice of democracy and the theory of democracy in this nation. They will each have a series of comments to make, and then I'll ask them a few questions, and we will have a conversation among all of us. Please welcome, once again, Professor West to the University of Chicago.
Always a pleasure to come to the University of Chicago. I'd like to thank my dear friend, colleague, and comrade, Professor Michael Dawson, for those very kind and generous remarks, how rare it is to see someone who could bring together such rigorous quantitative analysis with such rich social vision as he does in his work. And similarly so for my new friend and brother, Professor Cass Sunstein, who has a gift for clarity, has a knack for historical specificity, and in many ways wrestling with the legacy of Dewey here at the University of Chicago, especially being able to bring together progressive pragmatist sensibility and our understanding of law. I am very, very blessed to be a part of this conversation. I wish my dear friend and brother Roberto Unger, Professor Unger, who is now in Brazil, was able to be here because he's been involved in the election, the recent election there, and he will be coming to tour with me throughout the nation in 2 weeks or so. Thank you, each of you, for coming. Very brief remarks. I begin with two epigraphs. The first is from the great F.O. Matheson, Harvard literary critic, Christian democratic socialist, and gay brother. He said, would America be unique among modern nations to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity? What does he mean by maturity? That's one question I want to ask. Second, America's greatest playwright, Eugene O'Neill, after he had written The Iceman Cometh, one of the great masterpieces of the stage in this nation, said, what does it profit a nation to conquer the world and lose its soul? And I would add, a capitalist nation obsessed with profits. What does it profit such a nation to conquer the world and lose its soul? To talk about maturity, to talk about a soul of a nation is not some abstract, amorphous, vague discourse. For me, it has to do with casting a national limelight on the fetish of our time, on the idol of our age, the market. Ascribing magical powers to the market, uncritically worshiping the market. What do we mean by the market? It certainly is not part of the nature of things. It is a construct, a social, historical, and legal construct created by fallen, fallible human beings like you and me, which means it has virtues. At its best, it can generate levels of efficiency, levels of productivity. And it has its vices, to produce levels of inequality and isolation. What Professor Unger and I attempt to do in this text is to bring a radical democratic perspective to bear on an understanding of markets, capitalist markets. What's good? What's bad? What are the ways in which we can understand markets such that we accent the best and downplay the worst? What are the conditions, historical, political, social, legal conditions for the possibility of markets? How can their deleterious consequences be attenuated? How can their positive effects be accented? Very briefly, we look on the economic front, we see high levels of efficiency, high levels of productivity alongside escalating inequality. And if there's to be a future of American progressivism, we must learn how to talk clearly, succinctly about the efficiencies of markets on the one hand and the inequalities of markets under present day conditions. Why is there not a public conversation about the escalating, galloping economic inequality on the economic front? 1% of the population owning 46% of the financial assets of the country. Edward Wolff tells us in Top Heavy. No serious discussion about it. The top 10% owning 82% of the financial assets of the country. The rest of our fellow citizens, 90%, scrapping for the 18%, the big crumbs, as it were. But no serious conversation about it. As a Democrat, small d, it strikes me as oligarchic, plutocratic, and to some significant degree pigmentocratic. But no serious public conversation about it. A middle class, anxiety-ridden, wrestling with economic insecurity, fearful of being downsized. A working class over 25 years wrestling with stagnating wages, give-backs to management in the form of wages, pensions, and benefits. Speed-ups at the workplace, working harder and faster for less. Exactly. Exactly. Because that's what's at stake. The future, the babies, the children. Stretch outs, overworking, spending longer hours on the job, having less time for children and the babies. For less. And the working poor and very poor, if not demonized, rendered more and more invisible and sheer cannon fodder for market-driven industries like the prison industry. But no serious public conversation about it. I'm not simply talking about Monica Lewinsky when I say no serious public conversation. I'm talking about the last 10, 15, 20 years among both our political elites as well as ourselves. How long can American democracy survive in the face of this kind of inequality? America, the most unequal of nations in regard to distribution of wealth and income. And yet 20% of America's children live in poverty. 3% in Sweden, 7% in Canada, 10% in Britain, 20.5% in America, 42% of brown children, 51% of black children living in utter poverty in the richest nation in the history of the world. How long can American democracy survive with any sense of stability and justice in the face of this kind of inequality? Look on the cultural front. The relative erosion of the systems of caring and nurturing with devastating impact on young people, and the crystallization of a market-driven culture with its market moralities of hedonism and narcissism and egoism and rapacious individualism. And I should say at universities, short-sighted careerism. Of course, not University of Chicago, it's critical consciousness, it's Socratic dialogue. Vocation, not just profession, is calling, not just career, I know. But still frightening. What goes along with that market morality is a market mentality. I will get over and get mine by any means. I will be obsessed with that 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught in getting over. A market-driven culture resulting in levels of spiritual malnutrition and existential emptiness and failed intimacy and loneliness and sadness and isolation, because non-market values in a market-driven culture are pushed to the margins. Those non-market values like love and care and service to others and loyalty to a cause bigger than oneself. Frightening. And on the third front, political front, a public life more and more vacuous, impoverished, truncated, not simply owing to a market-driven politics, but moneyed interests, fundamentally shaping not just who we vote for, but the very framework in which the dialogue takes place. Our media itself, more and more run by oligopolies, subject to very little democratic accountability, only thin market accountability. How many consumers can they get? The fundamental question for any Democrat, small d, is always, what are the ways in which arbitrary power promotes unnecessary social misery? And that question, when substantively answered, cuts against the grain of history itself, because history, for the most part, is the history of elites, oligarchs, plutocrats, monarchs, queens, suzerains, czars, and czaresses, subjugating everyday people. And the distinctive mark of democracies, and especially American democracy, is how do we unleash the extraordinary genius of ordinary human beings such that their voices can be heard at the highest level of the decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate their lives. Not by idealizing or romanticizing ordinary people, but simply to say, if their voices can be heard by means of a fair procedure of public deliberation, they may not choose oligarchic arrangements in our economy. They may not choose to have so many fellow citizens wrestling with decrepit school systems in chocolate cities, or dilapidated housing, or inadequate health care, or not enough jobs with a living wage. But when they do not have this opportunity, we see something human, all too human. Greed run amok. Corporate greed, managerial greed, globally projected. Not because the rich are wealthy or powerful or less human than anybody else, but because they're human, all too human. And alongside that greed is a relative impotence and sense of powerlessness among fellow citizens. Of course, the government is run owing to powerful interests. That's why I abstain from voting. That's why I'm indifferent to politics. I just want to raise my children and live in a safe neighborhood. That's all. And then die with dignity. That's not enough for a democracy. That the poorest among us are as indispensable and ought to have access to decency and dignity as much as any of us. That's the audacious claim of democracy. And in this text, The Future of American Progressivism, we try to build on what we call this American religion of possibility. This attempt to always accent democratic possibilities. So on the economic front, we must talk seriously about the power of working people, a visionary labor movement, a fair tax system, ways in which the well-to-do voices can be heard but not suffocate the voices of others in regard to elections. So that in culture we can talk about moral and spiritual awakening around non-market values that result not simply in philanthropy, where 2/3 of the $124 billion given so graciously by fellow citizens go to elite institutions, and only 10% go to poor people. And it's a grand tradition, but it's tilted. We must go far beyond charity. We're talking about systemic justice. And that politically we can convince both the best and the brightest here at University of Chicago or here on the south side of Chicago as a whole. convince them that public life and public service is worthy of their time, their energy, their will. To try to quicken American democracy and see whether indeed we can keep the democratic project afloat in such a way that we can be proud and transmit it to the younger generation. Thank you very much.
I am delighted to introduce my colleague, Cass Sunstein, who will also share his thoughts for a few minutes before we have more of a dialogue and conversation among ourselves and with you. Cass Sunstein.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thanks to all of you for being here, and to the Seminary Co-op Bookstore for organizing this amazing event. I'm a little daunted by the size of the crowd and also by the presence here of an 8-year-old girl who's my daughter. To talk about the future of democracy, it would be good to have a conception of democracy, and the one for which I'll be speaking is an old one, not a new one. It's Madison's own, and Madison thought that a democracy should be deliberative. In his view, it was very important to have a large degree of accountability, hence people could be voted out of office, but also to ensure a large measure of reflection and reason-giving. So Madison had a distinctive conception of democracy, one that rejected highly populist models of the classical Republican sort, but that also rejected the conception of politics as a series of interest group deals. He wanted a deliberative democracy. This notion has been specified by, let's describe them as a quartet of important Americans, only one of whom was a professor. Madison himself, John Dewey, President Roosevelt, FDR, and Johnson. Madison referred to political equality. He was no egalitarian, but he referred to political equality as the first means of combating the evils of faction. He was committed to political equality. It's no accident that John Dewey was the founder of the lab school just about a block and a half from here, believing that education was a mechanism by which you could ensure that an otherwise heterogeneous population could have in it children who, for all their diversity, would have a capacity to have decent lives. President Roosevelt proposed something called, by him, a second Bill of Rights, which would ensure decent life conditions for everybody, something not included in the first Bill of Rights, something that he thought would not be imposed on America by a judicial elite, but that would be voted on by a deliberative public and implemented by it, not by judges. Johnson, of course, was responsible for the ideal of the Great Society, which was fully continuous with Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights. In all the years since Johnson, this quartet hasn't been fundamentally bucked by any president. Reagan and Bush were themselves, in one or another way, committed to the same basic notions. We can specify them a little bit to say that in the view of this quartet, a deliberative democracy was committed to political equality, to freedom from desperate conditions for all. That was not a foreign ideal in the founding period. It was repeatedly invoked in the founding period. Not equality, but freedom from desperate conditions. And decent opportunities for everybody. Now, if we move the clock back to Johnson's time, we can look at the last time American institutions were fundamentally rethought. And if we kind of collapse Roosevelt's innovations and Johnson's, we can see basically the government we now have. One that is committed to the ideal of deliberative democracy, that sees political equality, freedom from desperate conditions, and decent opportunities, not necessarily equal, but decent, as something that we are, at least in principle, committed to, combined with government institutions that were bequeathed to us, not by Reagan or Bush or Carter, but by Johnson and Roosevelt. These are the great bureaucracies of the New Deal and civil rights and Great Society periods. The ICC, I think, is dead. The Interstate Commerce Commission, that one's no longer around. But the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the Clean Air Act, and other kind of rigid, highly bureaucratized measures and institutions are very much with us today. They're the democratic government which is attempting to implement the ideals of the quartet. How have they performed? Well, you might think, if you're at the University of Chicago, you'd have your eye on two goals: efficiency and democracy. At some point, you might have to choose between them, but it would be nice if we could make a lot of progress without making such a choice. From the standpoint of efficiency, these institutions have not done extremely well. To take one example, the protection of the environment costs between $400 and $500 billion per year, and it doesn't deliver as much as it might given that massive expenditure. Indeed, estimates suggest that if we reallocated our resources from bad programs to good ones, we could save 60,000 lives each year without spending a penny more. Or we could save the same number of lives we now do and save $31 billion annually. We have terrible misallocation of resources in the public domain. From the standpoint of democracy, the institutions generated by Roosevelt and Johnson have been a terrible disappointment. You might think that Roosevelt's genius consisted of his wedding of the Jeffersonian ideal of democratic self-government with the Hamiltonian notion of a strong, centralized government whose basic authority was located in the presidency. What Roosevelt did was he was committed to the Jeffersonian notion of self-government, insisted on it, but he relocated it from small-scale institutions to the presidency itself with a democratic goal. That has been a failure. Very frequently, our government is issuing very rigid command and control regulations, looking not so different from 5-year plans, as the EPA says. Pollution must be cut this amount, by this year, and it doesn't happen. Okay, from the standpoint of efficiency, we've expended a lot more money than we might. From the standpoint of democracy, we've ended up with a lot of regulations as intergroup accommodations rather than a reflection of political accountability or deliberative government. Okay, what can we do now? Well, if we're interested in efficiency, we might think to ourselves that people need a lot more information. That from the standpoint of having efficient markets, it would be really great if participants in market ordering knew a lot about the market transactions into which they were entering. This isn't a foreign notion to American government since the New Deal. There's a little regulation, little in the sense that if you saw all the regulations, this would just seem like a tiny one. But it's called the Hazard Communication Standard. It's a little effort to tell American workers about the hazards of the jobs they face. And it seems to have been quite a success. It's cheap, it does some good. People know what the risks are, and they can leave, and they sometimes do, and employers are afraid of that, and it has an effect. Not so bad. If you look at the old workers' compensation program, it has been terrifically successful in cutting workplace deaths more so than the Occupational Safety and Health Act because it speaks not in terms of information, but in terms of economic incentives. If it's the case that workplaces are dangerous, employers are going to feel it in the pocketbook. By some estimates, we have 30% fewer workplace deaths as a result of the workers' compensation statute than we otherwise would. The Occupational Safety and Health Act can't claim any such success. There's a tiny little statute a little provision that was intended just to give the EPA some information. In this statute, the EPA gets notice of the level of toxic pollution by polluters. The EPA just is told about it. This was thought to be an information gathering mechanism which would have no good effects by itself. In fact, this little provision has been the most smashing success story in all of American law. It's a mechanism by all of American environmental law. It's a mechanism by which polluters have actually started to compete to reduce pollution for fear either of political opprobrium or public or political sanction as a result of having high levels of toxic pollutants. This is a model on which we can draw. The suggestion is instead of rigid and highly bureaucratized command and control, if what we want is efficient government, we would move in the direction of information and incentives with these notions as a model. What about democracy? Well, I will confess, I hope I can retain my job, the priority of democratic goals to economic goals for a deliberative polity. What would we want to do if we were trying to promote democratic goals? It turns out that along a wide domain, democratic and economic goals march hand in hand. Take, for example, the problem discussed by Cornel West and Roberto Unger in the book, nicely discussed, of the democratization of the media. We have a media in which there isn't a whole lot of democratic talk. This, which is being televised by CNN, it is to be hoped an exception. But we have a media in which attention to public issues is relatively rare, and an opportunity to speak by diverse voices isn't regularly afforded. What might be done about this? Well, here's a simple idea. Every broadcaster in the United States ought to have to keep a public log in which it tells the American people, not just the FCC, but the American people about its public service activities. What sort of free airtime is provided for candidates, if any? What sort of educational programming for children is provided? What sort of community public services are offered? What kind of access to people not ordinarily entitled to access to public airways does it provide? This is a pretty cheap measure. It just involves paper. It's an experiment. There is no such requirement now. The hunch is by itself this would do considerable good. From the standpoint of economic incentives, there's a tremendous amount of potential movement on the part of American democracy. In the 1990 Clean Air Act, President Bush ended up supporting a very aggressive regulation of sulfur dioxide because he was shown that an emissions trading system, which basically means it's costly to pollute, and if you're not going to pollute, you can make money by reducing your emission and sell such allocation of pollution as you have to someone else. Basically, that's been a terrific success. First, from the economic standpoint, second, and more fundamentally, from the democratic standpoint, because in 1990, for the first time in the nation's history, America decided what level of pollution it wanted to produce. And we've gotten there. It's been a fantastic success. So, my suggestion is the conception of democracy that we ought to endorse is one of deliberative democracy. It has some pretty simple ideals that are deeply rooted in our tradition, involving political equality, freedom from desperate conditions, and decent opportunities for all. Modest goals, not radical goals. That we should shift from command and control regulation of the sort that the New Deal and the Great Society have bequeathed to us in the direction of information and incentives, much more flexible, market-oriented instruments that enlist rather than oppose democratic forces. Let me end with two quotations from a famous law professor at the University of Chicago, and it must be added, Columbia, Carl Llewellyn. The quotation is part of oral history, and there are two versions of it. And I'll leave it to you which you like better. A good democracy needs both. I guess I'll confess I like the second a little more. The first goes, technique without morals is a menace. but morals without technique is a mess. The second is, morals without technique is a mess, but technique without morals is a menace. Thank you.
I think I'll it's on, just that my voice is not. I think I'll start with a simple question. You both have talked about, both in your books and in your talks, about the need to revitalize American politics, to bring deliberation back to American politics, and to have a wider range, in fact, the widest possible range of citizens participate in that deliberation. I have my own ideas about what the question is, but not so much what the answer is. What are some of the obstacles to deliberative democracy? To what degree what are some of the concerns we might have? Cass expressed concern for a populist notion of deliberative democracy, but in the future of American progressivism, I got the sense that Professor West would be willing to open it up and take some risks. What are those risks? How should we open it up? To what degree should we open it up? How do we start a conversation about politics, about what the good society should be, that both of you seem to call for in different ways?
No, I appreciate the question. I think the first thing we need to do is examine closely the neoliberal orthodoxy that's now afoot, not just in the land, but in the world. I think the recent events on the international markets really behooves us to do that. I mean, it's always striking to me when I hear these metaphors in relation to markets of bloodbath and carnage and so forth. I say, well, I know somebody's having a rough time, but that's rather extravagant language in talking about these markets where it comes to human beings and it's just downsized or collateral damage. And I said, oh, I see. I think we've got to examine the neoliberal orthodoxy. See, to be a Democrat, small d, means to be experimental, improvisational, jazz-like, willing to be protean, flexible, and fluid. And right now, we've got a rigidity and orthodoxy, not just in America, though America is the world power at the moment, but it's around the world. And if we take seriously escalating social misery of Russian brothers and sisters, in Brazilian brothers and sisters, African brothers and sisters, there must be a way of rethinking the way in which markets operate so we can, as I mentioned before, hold on to the efficiency, because markets are here to stay. We don't have other ways of dealing with price mechanisms in mass, complex, heterogeneous populations. There's no alternative at the moment that would preserve the kind of liberties and rights that we want. But on the other hand, if the only option is the neoliberal orthodoxy, which is so-called free markets, which is so misleading that needs to be demystified and demythologized, I think it's done so well in Brother Cass's work on free markets and social justice, that markets do not exist without some legal backdrop, which means there's some governmental intervention always already when we talk about markets. The question is, what are the conditions under which markets are allowed to operate? And I don't think any of us have a blueprint. That was the trap that the Soviet Union fell into and ran into the wall of history with all of the bloodshed. So the question is, we don't have a blueprint, how do we proceed? Experimentally. But if we proceed experimentally, it means we're going to have to begin to shatter some of this orthodoxy that's around.
The question is a very big one. One is, how do we overcome failures of participation, and the other is, to what extent do we want to do that? A problem with widespread participation, I'm sure we don't disagree with this, is under conditions of political inequality, you can have a kind of soundbite politics at its worst. kind of the California referenda system. And so what you might think would be a problem with certain populist systems is that under conditions in which political inequality is so stark that the referendum, from no standpoint, will be a terrific success. It'll just express rage. Tell you what I like a lot better. There's an idea by a deliberative Democrat, not me, to institute something called a deliberative opinion poll. Very different from what we usually rely on. And what he did was to bring diverse people together. It's happened in England with some influence, and it's been got little attention in the United States. Get people of diverse walks of life together and have them talk about issues. See what kinds of movement you see, both on the issues and in terms of human relations. And the success has been very, very substantial. I'll tell you a very brief story, which will stand, I hope, as an illustration of the ways in which this can make politics both more participatory and more deliberative. There was a woman from New York who was in one of these deliberative opinion polls on the first day, and she talked about, she's African American, she referred to her family. There was a child and no no husband or father was in the picture. There was a guy from Texas or something who exploded at her and said, you have no family. You are not entitled to use that term. A family means two parents and a child, and don't you talk in my presence about family, about your situation. They didn't talk to each other the next couple of days, but they were in small groups a lot, and they talked about issues a lot in this group. And on the last day, he came up to her as they were saying goodbye and said, what are the three most important words in the English language? She looked at him, and he said, I was wrong.
This is probably not fair, but that's not my job. I know a fair amount about the deliberative opinion poll, and one of the features of that work is that you bring people often out of their communities to some central place. And we also know from other research on deliberation and public opinion, again, in this case, not my research, but research that's been done at this university, that when you get, for example, racially integrated audiences, we have people come to different judgments, and in fact, we have people come bringing different considerations. They take different paths to the judgments they come to. What will it take, or isn't it something we should be concerned about, that when people are among people who are like themselves, they talk in one way, they come to one set of judgments. Well, when they come together, they actually not only have different set of judgments, they have different thought processes, and in fact, if you dare use the phrase, they might even learn. What are the mechanisms that we should encourage to bring about the type of discussions that are used, that are a function of the deliberative opinion poll, for example?
Well, there's a very important democratic phenomenon which consists of preference falsification, in which people will, in some groups, speak one way, and another group speak in another way, because of the reputational consequences of the one or the other. And Mill was alert to this. This creates terrible problems for democracy, where you don't know which is the more authentic, because maybe when people are engaging in self-censorship, it's because of ideals which they really hold dear, or maybe it's because they just don't want to be hated. Right? That's very different. I don't have a general answer to that, except that this is Michael's expertise, to be very skeptical of polls under conditions of anonymity, because people might be responding to perceived reputational effects.
I would want to make a distinction between public conversation and public deliberation. I'm for both, but I think they're very different things. Because public conversation has to do precisely with fellow citizens coming together and reflecting on public issues and hoping that there's some collective response to these issues, even as it preserves our own individuality. But public deliberation has to do with voices heard at those sites where crucial public decisions are being made. One of the reasons why Roberto Unger and I, and Sylvia Ann Hewlett and I had called for the same thing in the war against parents, but in the future of American progressivism, we call for mandatory voting. That every American citizen ought to take just a few minutes every 2 or 4 years to reflect on the prospects of the republic. And if they don't vote, a penalty. And people say, oh, that's coercive. But you see, if we had mandatory voting, then our politicians would spend a little more time with some of the folk who they tend to overlook or ignore. And that's deliberation. That has to do with decisions being made. You see, that's something very different. Same would be true at the workplace. You see, if corporate profits are up 200%, what they are since 1980, and CEO salaries are up 400%, and Fortune 500 company CEO salaries are up 925%, and yet wages are down. This is not just a call for public conversation. Public deliberation means that maybe those workers ought to have some voice in who's getting this wealth. Now, how do we come up with ways of allowing for that kind of deliberation to take place? I'm as much interested in that particular kind of activity as I am in the public conversation where people get together from different neighborhoods and talk.
We live in a city that's known for extraordinarily rough and tumble politics. I could say more and won't.
You know more than anybody else.
Don't go there.
No, I'm a scholar. I'm a scholar.
Right, yeah, a scholar. This is drawn from Professor Unger's and Professor West's book, but I know that Cass and I will probably have something to say at some point about this. On one hand, I see a genuine and I think welcome concern not to dehumanize any group of people, even if they have enormous amounts of money. But on the other hand, both you and Professor Susstein are extremely concerned about political equality. And you and Professor Unger, for example, call for changes in legislation and norms that would allow the unionization of temporary workers. Now, I'll say a little bit about my background. I used to be a shop steward in a state called California, which is, as you know, not the most hospitable to the trade union movement. What type of systematic opposition? For example, we talked about the 1%, you talked about the 1% that owns 46% of the financial assets. Would you expect the type of proposal that would do what you would call democratize the workplace? For example, I can see Mr. Gates being thrilled by the idea of Microsoft temporary workers being unionized. The harder question, I think, you keep talking about Democrat with a small d, with a zeal. What are the political channels, forces, and organizations that you foresee building, or having us build, I don't mean you personally, seeing building over the next decade that could push through something that would allow increased unionization? We live in the post-PATCO era.
Yes, and there's a number of questions there, and those are very difficult, those questions, actually. I think one thing we have to say is that that none of these strategies or tactics constitute a panacea or a quick fix. That we have to be experimental about the various strategies and tactics that we have. When I talk about calls for workers' power, there's no doubt in my mind that unionized workers have a better chance at the bargaining table vis-a-vis management than non-unionized workers. There's no accident that capital runs to Arkansas, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Indiana, all right-to-work states, as opposed to some other states that I know. where union power makes a difference. But that doesn't mean that unions are in any way perfect, pure, or pristine. It simply means that these are institutional tools that historically have and continue to play a fundamental role if workers are not to be viewed as simply disposable commodities, to be downsized in order to make big profits to satisfy stockholders so that your company becomes more attractive and appealing on Wall Street. And what we're after is some democratic countervailing force against that kind of practice, which is so widespread among corporate elites, going both to right-to-work states as well as, of course, other parts of the world. Now, that doesn't mean then that, but when you say that Bill Gates would be delighted at the unionization of temporary workers, could you say a little more about that? Why that?
Besides the fact I was being facetious, I worked in Silicon Valley for about 10 years. One of the great mechanisms, essentially, I think between me and my wife, we held every non-management job possible to hold, from cutting silicon into blocks, soldering. I used to have massive burns on my hands because I was the plus of the family. Temporary workers are a vital part of the type of the information-intensive workforces that theorists of the global economy like to point to. There's an immense relying on temporary workers, not just at the production level in the sense of producing printed circuit boards or integrated circuits, but in terms of you bringing in programmers and engineers now and as temporary consultants. The ideal that temporary workers have been used as a way in the electronic industry to make sure it's very even harder to unionize. So the basic point was, it's not just the old industries of steel, auto, glass, and rubber that would be, I would suspect, intensely hostile to a revitalization of the union movement. We're at a historic low in union coverage of work. But also the new service industry and the new information industries will both be hostile and systematically, I think, put their economic power in the service of political campaigns.
But see, that depends in part on just the how deep and broad division is of the unionizers. Unfortunately, privileged sectors of workers are often pitted against the less privileged sector of workers. And what we're seeing, I think, under John Sweeney and others, an attempt to say, look, we cannot fall into that trap. There has to be ways of unionizing those who have been overlooked and at the same time sustain the strength of those relatively privileged workers who have been unionized a while. And that's a serious discussion going on within the union movement. But I'm talking much more about the visionary union leaders, because again, unionization is not a panacea, but it is a necessary condition. It may not be a sufficient, but it's a necessary condition if there's going to be any countervailing force against the power of corporate elites, not just transnational capital. I think a lot of times we talk about globalization in such a way that we downplay the capital that stays here. And the degree to which, 90% of American workers are actually working not for the Fortune 500 company, right? And that's a crucial set of sites as well. But I'm talking too much, though.
I guess the only thing I'd say is that you might want to do two things. Ensure, as modest goals, ensure that everyone has, pretty decent material resources. Now, not through necessarily a government handout, but through like the earned income tax credit and good education, and then help for people who aren't helped by that. Another thing you might want to do is ensure that economic inequalities aren't transformed into political inequalities. Economic inequalities, so long as people aren't having desperate conditions, economic inequalities don't seem to me to be the worst problem facing America today. And I take that as consistent with both of these books. A real problem is when economic inequalities are turned into political inequalities. And the Supreme Court in Buckley against Vallejo made a really terrible mistake in saying that the Constitution prohibited the government from trying to ensure that political equality existed even under conditions of economic inequality. And what Congress does with campaign finance, I mean, that's not some new, Lyndon Johnson or something idea. That's what Madison was after, was political equality. So I think there's a lot to be done with our political system, consistently with Buckley against Vallejo, and ultimately to convince the Supreme Court to overrule Buckley against Vallejo. At least 2 votes, probably at least 3 votes. Small court, we're getting there. To allow the democratic process to ensure political, not economic equality. So it's the translation that is, the first bothersome thing.
I think there the crucial question is whether we know of a historical moment in which economic inequality has not been translated into political inequality. Because if that's what we're concerned about, but there have been times in which there's been economic inequality, but it hasn't been translated into political inequality, then we've got an interesting historical moment. I don't know of one, actually.
Well, it is true that under conditions of economic inequality, especially if there's a severe inequality, political equality, you're not very likely to get. But you have to specify what we mean by economic equality. And I guess I think that if we could ensure that everyone had first, decent life prospects, and second, freedom from desperate conditions. We could do that in, by the time my daughter is 15, it'd be pretty good. She's 8 now. If we could do that in 7, that's a long-term project. And economic equality is, it depends on what we mean by that. If we mean it literally, I think we could do a lot of great things before we get to the more contentious question. We could do a lot to reduce political inequality that the Supreme Court hasn't let us do.
One last question before I open it up to the audience. One thing we have not directly addressed is the question of race. And particularly since both of you are so deeply concerned about economic and political equality and economic injustice, and have talked about, on one hand, deliberative democracy, and on the other, bringing people together around a new vision and new imagination of America, how do you see the interaction between racial and economic injustice and overcoming some of the historic divisions that have plagued both the nation in general and progressive movements particularly?
Well, I only know one thing about this, which is that markets won't eliminate racial inequality or racial injustice. That's the only thing that seems to me clear, is that the notion of free markets as a terrific, they do some good. Like once you got rid of apartheid in South Africa, you prevented a kind of state obstruction of free mobility. And once you prevented that obstruction, that was good for racial issues. And in America, once Jim Crow was broken, it was better to do that than not to do that. But the only thing that's very clear and that is important to insist on is that for various reasons, customer discrimination, fellow employee discrimination, free markets, they have a lot of great virtues and they can do a lot of good things. One thing they can't do is, under current American conditions, do a lot by themselves, unsupplemented, to reduce racial inequality. That's one kind of problem. And racial discrimination, let's just define them as different problems. Free markets, they won't do all of what we need. That's the only thing I know.
I think one of the reasons, as I recall from your article, a fascinating article, is because markets tend to presuppose existing preferences and prejudices rather than contest those preferences and prejudices. And that's a very important point in terms of the weight of social norms on the one hand, and the calls for changes in social norms and practices. For me, when we talk about vicious legacies of white supremacy and male supremacy, we have to acknowledge first that the vast majority of black, brown, red, and yellow people are working people. And therefore, the issue of economic inequality is inseparable, inextricable from this legacy of white supremacy. The vast majority of women, of sisters of all colors, are working people. Now, many may work in domestic spheres and not receive wages, but the last time I looked in patriarchal families and other families, these women were working very, very hard, and more are working in the labor force as well. And therefore, when we're talking about race and gender, it's not as if we're adding something called class in some academic manner, but these elements are so constitutive of each other that the issue of economic inequality is always already a way of addressing crucial dimensions of legacies of racism, of sexism. I would add homophobia. I would add the devaluing of physically challenged people. Same is true in relation to age. Look at the poverty rate in 1959 among the elderly, 35%, now 10%, owing to what? Some significant power institutionalized in public policy. So that we haven't been able to deal with the psychosexual dimension of race, for example. That's another C-SPAN show. And it's not reducible to economic inequality about how black bodies are perceived and brown bodies are perceived, or women's bodies and gender, but to talk about economic inequality as a fundamental factor that sits at or near the center, though it doesn't exhaust the complexity of race and gender, is something I think needs to be noted.
On that note, let's open it up again. If you wish to ask one of the panelists a question, please line up on my right at the microphone.
It is.
Good evening. Mr. West, I read your book, Race Matters. It was an excellent book. I have a question for you. What system is better than our free market system? Name one. Not Brazil, not Indonesia, not Russia. They crumbled. They were communists.
Well, they're crumbling now because of capitalism, though, aren't they?
Yes, but they accepted capitalism money. Yeah. They went against their own Karl Marx principles. They accepted capitalistic money. So I'd like you to tell me which system is better than ours. And I have no problem with you saying experiment with the market. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Right. I'd like to know what system is better than ours.
Yes, no, I appreciate that question. No, I really right. Really do. That's because possessive. I'm a little leery of. I mean, at what point do black people say that, well, the slave auction was linked to markets and that wasn't our system? Well, Jim Crow was linked to markets. That wasn't our system. Now all of a sudden it's ours. No. Now at what point is it really ours? We're in it. We're all in it. We have to wrestle with it.
Right. Not ours per se. Yes. I'm saying which one is better than the free market in the United States.
Oh, I thought you said something else.
Right. No. Yeah. Which was better?
All right. No, I appreciate it, though, brother. Right. And you have a right to say it's yours and so forth. I'm just saying I want some critical distance on this thing. You know what I mean? That's all. That's all.
Right.
Because I think the case of Russia is quite instructive in many ways. The communist regime in Russia was repressive. It was regimenting. It generated levels of social misery and violation of rights and liberties that was immoral. What happened? An introduction of market forces with no nation state or public administration or civil society that could constitute strong enough background conditions for those markets. And the result is what? the gangsterization of that society. Militia, mafia, escalating violence, and so forth. That could be an omen for what global capitalism is if our nation state is more and more weakened, which is the case, if our civil society is more and more weakened, and if our public administration is weakened. That's frightening to me. You see what I mean? Now, that doesn't mean that we're making a choice between one system up here and another system. History is not like that, you see. The question is, how do we tease out democratic possibilities wherever we are? Wherever we are, you see. If I'm in Ethiopia, where I live part of the year, under a communist regime, I have to bring democratic critique to bear. And of course, there I tend to be much more pro-market, because markets can be deployed there in such a way that they open up democratic possibilities. Then I come back to the most market-obsessed civilization, the United States, and I have to say, no, there's some fetishizing going on here. We need to tease out democratic possibilities that constitute countervailing forces against those markets. So it's not going to be a question of communism here, socialism here, capitalism here. Capitalism in Sweden, and it's as capitalist society as any other society, produces less social misery. See what I mean? Why? Because they've been able to tease out democratic possibilities for that population, owing to a stronger labor movement, a whole host of other things. So it's not a choice of systems in the abstract way. Wherever we are, we're trying to raise the question, how can everyday people, ordinary people's lives have more decency and dignity? And that's going to cut against the grain.
So I mean,
from one context to the other.
The best out of capitalism system, then, essentially what you're saying, we can get some good out of it.
Oh, sure. Very much so. Right. We can't get any good out of these systems, then we all in deep trouble. Right. You know, it's time to look at Yorick's skull.
Good evening. Whenever I hear this socialist, anti-socialist debate, I always sort of am led to think of the opening line of Anna Karenina, which is, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. The pro-market rhetoric commonly says that the differences in economic standing among people is not necessarily bad in se, and the socialist rhetoric tends to attack the economic differences, the disparity that markets generate. I was wondering if you, Mr. West, how would you affect these changes, and how would those be different from any number of other socialist societies that have tried and failed, tried and crumbled? And if you could also please differentiate your system from Sweden as well, which, while not, I don't think, to be truly market-driven, also has suffered a significant drop in the standard of living since the Second World War, as far as I know.
Appreciate the question, at least a number of questions there, and I'll try to be very brief. One thing, as I said before, I'm not sure that it's helpful to talk about system capital S. That we're talking about specific contexts in which we find ourselves and trying to understand the balance of forces. Some of those forces are democratic forces that focus on working people, everyday citizens. Some of those forces are forces that downplay the needs of those everyday forces. That is a question of democracy and less democracy, sometimes anti-democracy. So it's not a question of system per se. I mean, people talk about socialism as if we're living in the Cold War. I don't know of any socialists these days, of any seriousness, who want to eliminate markets. And that's what the Soviet project was. They wanted to eliminate markets. And what happened? They regimented their populations. The markets went underground. They couldn't generate levels of prosperity, and most of the efficiency was in the military. You see what I mean? So it's not going to be a question at all of talking about eliminating markets. The question is, how do we humanize, democratize these rights for human interests as opposed to solely profits? That doesn't mean eliminating profits. It means trying to understand the role of profits vis-a-vis human interests, human needs, and so on. You see. And so I do not believe that Americans should look for any blueprint anywhere else. The American Democratic Project is a thoroughly American democratic road to American Democratic Project. It will be unique, distinctive, and experimental. I mean, part of the problem is that we've got this bad American exceptionalism that thinks that somehow as a city on the hill with our markets that we can escape the forces of history. And Roberto Unger and I are simply saying, let's exchange some bad American exceptionalism with some good American experimentalism. That's the basic thesis. And where we end up, we don't know. Where was FDR going to end up when he put forward that powerful speech of January 11, 1944, State of the Union that Professor Susstein talked about, the second Bill of Rights? A right to a decent job, a right to a quality education. That's subversive talk for 1998, isn't it?
Hi, I want to thank you for talking tonight, and everybody there. I think it's very telling that Professor Cornel West, you said you have to tease out democracy. I think that's a real sad commentary in the United States of America. But my question is directed towards both the professors. In listening to Professor Sunstein, I've never read your works before, so I can't judge you in any way, but just listening to you, it sounds like you want to smooth out the edges of out-of-control capitalism or have a kinder out-of-control capitalism. And I'm not sure exactly, I don't know where you stand. I just would like to know, in your hearts, both professors, in your hearts, do you want just to smooth out a few rough edges, or do you want some real structural change that would help people? Thank you.
Okay. Oliver Wendell Holmes said general propositions do not decide concrete cases. And I guess I don't have anything good to say about socialism in the abstract. I mean, if what's understood by socialism is efforts to ensure that people don't live under desperate conditions, well, you know, Roosevelt and Madison and Jefferson were all socialists. So, I mean, I think I agree with Professor West that these abstractions often can just create holy wars where people might really be able to be in agreement. I wouldn't say all I want to do is smooth out the edges of out-of-control capitalism. I don't know what any of those words mean, but I'm sure I would. But or make real structural change. Yes, I do think we should have real structural change. Would it be right to say we have too much reliance on markets? And with respect to the media, I believe we do. With respect to environmental law, we've enlisted markets too little. Now, to say we've enlisted markets too little is not to say we shouldn't regulate air pollution. Of course we should. But morals without technique is a mess, and that's what our environmental laws look like. So I think, you know, we can talk, the holy wars between socialism and capitalism, let's stipulate capitalism is one, but what conception of capitalism? We could have, you know, dozens of different conceptions of capitalism. One of the proposals I like best in Professor West's book is for a consumption tax. I think it's a terrific idea, and that's something that a lot of conservative economists think is a great idea. It would do about 8 different good things. And, you know, we can, instead of thinking, am I a capitalist, therefore what do I like? Or am I a socialist, what do I like? We might, you know, be able to make real progress once we get concrete. We can talk, if you like, about why a progressive consumption tax would be, you know, a really good thing. I believe hardly anyone would be hurt by it. People who wanted to buy lots of boats might appear to be hurt by it, but very few people really love having lots of boats. It's that, you can compare yourself to others who have fewer boats, but once everyone has a consumption tax, then you're going to have you're going to be in the same place in the line of boatness as other people. And as I say, this is an idea that a lot of conservatives like, liberals like. It's a good idea. We should have bipartisan consensus for some version of it.
And just very briefly, certainly I would want to call for structural changes, and one sees it in the text, but I was glad to see somebody invoke the great Count from Russia, Leo Tolstoy, who was obsessed with the moral dimension of social arrangements. And I speak as a Christian. I'm deeply concerned about the moral and spiritual dimensions, not just the political and the economic. And if we put it in these terms, how do we create conditions in such a way that human greed and human bigotry and human impotence does not do injurious harm to other people? Now see, that's a tough question, but that's also what we're talking about. And the greed's in each and every one of us, but some people can exercise the greed in such a way that it actually does make it difficult for other people to function, to eat, to have access to a decent home and so forth. Same is true with bigotry. And the same is true with powerlessness. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Powerlessness also corrupts. It makes it difficult for us to really feel as if we're in the same boat, in the same democratic project, as it were. And so that's a moral discourse that can cut a lot of different political and ideological directions. And I do not believe, actually, in proselytizing. I do not want persons to fully agree with me. I just want to be disquieting. Get people to think and be unsettled. We're all going to move in different directions, but we're still part of the same democratic project. So then how do we relate to one another? That's what I'm after. And the structural change as well.
Given that markets aren't going anywhere, is there a way to make public discourse, a high energy politics, a market value? To have the market working on behalf of public discourse, and what experiments would you suggest?
Well, I like information and incentives. Two ideas you might have is to try to publicize the extent of public talk allowed on the media by people who own stations, which is no criticism of people who own stations. They are responsive to incentives. And if this was public, a hunch is we'd have the same kind of competition we've seen in the environmental area. Hunch may be wrong. Let's see what happens. With economic incentives, there are lots of things we could do to make the provision of public talk either subsidized or the failure to do that taxed. And this is just building on stuff that in the environmental area has worked pretty well.
Mm-hmm. I like the experimental spirit behind the question, though. Certainly markets can be used for non-market ends, and markets can be used for democratic ends. And one of the ways one thinks of doing that, for example, is through the entertainment industry, trying to convince a number of highly visible persons that the kinds of changes and values that you're promoting ought to be put forward in their art. That would contribute to, in fact, the kind of moral, political, spiritual awakening. And this is so true for the younger generation, because for so many young folk across race, music is the last form of transcendence in such a flat, hollow, shallow culture. And yet they are affected. Ideas do matter. Stories matter. Images matter. Art matters. Entertainment matters. You know what I mean? And so I think it's important to accent the role of those cultural workers, some of whom are artists, and the impact that they can have.
One concrete example, partly that's been discussed in a number of venues, is that I think we lost a huge opportunity when they auctioned the bandwidth. Are you going to tell me that NBC would have said, we don't want the high definition bandwidth if you make us put, as one example is in your book that I know that Cass Sunstein agrees with, televised political speech during political campaigns. NBC would still have bought it, and they would put out 2 to 3 hours blocks, as would ABC. There's a lot, without the type of information, the public discourse that says that we're about to give away $1 trillion worth of air. What should this country do with it? What price do we want to extract? Those type of opportunities to use markets creatively and use incentives creatively are going to be the province of lobbyists and lawyers and the like who aren't concerned with opening up that discussion.
To the panel at large, as much as it seems to be a positive agenda to try to shatter the neoclassical structure and to tease out democracy from existing markets, these structures seem to be based on exactly what you've talked about, on a fetishism of markets and a very systematized and strategic psychological component. People will use markets because they've been taught to, and they have turned the market into an idol, very simply. So if it's desired to change radically market systems, what is the best way you think to address the psychological or the psychocultural component that is keeping people inherited to the market system? And if you're going to talk about liberation movements, feminism, and racial movements and sexual liberation, then address how is it possible to have these liberation movements and not have them marginalize themselves, to have small victories with larger negative power consequences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tough question, though. Did you want to say one? It's a very tough question, but look at it this way. There was a time in which monarchs, kings and queens, were fetishized. And it took some very courageous liberals and Democrats to become revolutionaries and say, look, your allegiance to these particular icons and idols leads toward these devastating consequences. Why don't you take a tremendous risk and try this embryonic democratic experiment? Oh, we can't live without kings. We can't live without queens. Monarchs, oh my God, they're necessary conditions for the possibility of any good society. Who told you that? You need some demystifying. And that's what went on at a particular moment, and new democratic energies were unleashed. You see what I mean? In the same way, 508 BC with Cleisthenes, who thinks that you can move from kinship to loyalty to something bigger than the clannish connection? Democratic spirit allowing an assent to a certain kind of loyalty and allegiance. One of the roles that I think we all can play is to begin to demythologize and demystify the market, not trashing it, but demythologize and demystify it so people began to see both the nature of their connection, but also some of the alternatives and options, building on the best of those markets, but also seeing that the worst is pulling the rug out from under all of us. And that's an educational process, that's a political process, it's a moral process, it's an artistic process, and it's also quite existential and visceral.
Professor Cass Sustain mentioned that economic inequalities doesn't seem to be the worst problem. The worst problem is political inequalities. But I don't see how you can economic and political inequalities doesn't go hand in hand. And I'm referring to the issue with the Supreme Court justices not hiring black law students, minorities, to be clerks on that level. And I'd like to know what you think about that, because if you don't hire them, give them the opportunity to work at that level, they'll never be able to get jobs from the big law firms, other corporate industries, or that sort of thing. So I think it really does go hand in hand. You don't have economic inequality there. Equality there. What is your viewpoint on that? Because these judges don't have to answer to anybody. Right. So how do you make them abide by EEOC standards, and they are regulating those standards amongst all the other corporations and levels of government throughout the country.
Two good questions there. One local and the other massive. Take the local one, which I feel a little more comfortable. I know a little tiny bit about it, which is Supreme Court law clerks. I clerked for Justice Marshall, and he had, year after me, had 2 African American clerks, and he had 2 in the previous years. And Justice Marshall had a lot of African American clerks. And well, I can just say that the 2 in this year after me had a lot better grades than I had. Don't repeat that. My grades weren't that bad. The Supreme Court clerks, I don't know a whole lot about the general statistics. I guess I want to know, to the extent that the percentage of African American law clerks for the court is very low. I want to figure out why that is exactly. I think the best thing to do, really, I think the justices are, every single one of them listens to arguments and is reasonable. And I think to the extent that this local problem exists, and the recent data, which I've seen, strongly supports what you say, the thing to do is to talk about it. There's no law that binds them, but Justice Ginsburg, a moderate, and Justice Rehnquist, Chief Justice Rehnquist, a conservative, I'm sure they're very uncomfortable with this. And the more it's talked about, I don't think either of them is the sort of person who really caves into pressure. That they're people who, this is not something that fits with their highest ideals. So I think this is something that each one of them should search their conscience, and we'll see what happens. About economic inequality and political inequality, that's the really large issue, and I think both you and Cornel West are right to say that there's a link between them. I'll tell you what I think, which is that every society that's really insisted on economic equality has produced neither political equality nor economic equality. So, we have to figure out what we mean by economic equality. Do we mean that everybody has the same amount of money? That is, a recipe for tyranny under most imaginable conditions. Maybe at the University of Chicago, every faculty member is paid the same thing. I don't know, but generally, that the pursuit of economic equality seems to me a goal that is either dangerous or too utopian to put as the number one thing on our agenda. Now, what I would like to do is bracket that question and focus on something that diverse people ought to be able to converge on, which is that desperate conditions are not acceptable in a free society. And Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winner, not thought to be a socialist, agrees. Milton Friedman thinks the idea of a negative income tax is great. And so I think a extremely serious problem for America is that so many people, including children, live under desperate conditions. And what they need is, equality would be, if we could give them decent food, housing, education, decent life prospects, and material goods, that would be great. I think there's a separate problem, which is serious and not unrelated, which is political inequality, which is, a bad violation of long-standing American ideals. I'm really intrigued by the suggestion of making voting compulsory. I'm not sure I'm ready to sign on, but I'll tell you a couple of reasons I'm intrigued by it. One is that that it would be good for Americans to think about the right to vote in a different way from the way they now do. To have it be sanctified a little bit, a kind of secular sanctification of something which is, a very hard one. Think of the first sentence, my favorite sentence in the Constitution, the first sentence of the 14th Amendment. It says, all citizens born naturalized in the United States. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. Everyone is a citizen by being born here. That's not that usual. We all have a right to vote. So to make that seem not like everything else, that would be good. And also, it is the case, a very nice paragraph in this book, Cornel West's book, is that every society that's had this compulsory voting law, people haven't wanted to get rid of it after a little while. So to some extent, people's preferences are adaptive to what sort of situation and social life they find themselves in. Amartya Sen, yesterday's Nobel Prize winner for, hooray, economics. One of his greatest contributions was to say we ought not to take, and this is internal to economics, we ought not to take people's preferences as given. They're adaptive to what sort of society they find themselves in. If you find yourself in a society in which voting is kind of sanctified, you might have a different attitude toward voting. Now, is that tyrannical, or is it kind of consistent with the project of liberal education? Seems to be more like the latter.
There's another reason to perhaps support compulsory voting. Children don't vote. Often the parents of desperate children don't vote, and their policy preferences are not reflected in Congress, the executive branch, and other branches of government. If we had full political participation, there would have to be a wider discourse and a wider set of inputs through the voting mechanisms into the policy process.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sylvia Ann Hewlett and I actually called for, we were trying to be provocative, that parents could vote as many times as were based on the number of children that they had. They could then vote and see how many politicians come running to neighborhoods they aren't ordinarily used to going to.
Professor Sunstein talked about desperate conditions precluding political equality. And I'll admit that I have a bias on this. I'm the youth organizer for the Democratic Socialists of America. But I wonder, in my experience, both the lack of health care and the lack of child care resulted in desperate conditions. And I'm wondering if you agree that this is a desperate condition, and if so, do you think it's time for a non-market response to the lack of health care and the lack of child care that so many families face?
Well, since we're celebrating Amartya Sen and his getting the Nobel Prize, he has this great book on India, and he makes it, which it is on India, but it works for every society, I think. He says there's a difference between market supplementing and market displacing measures. Mm-hmm. And you might think, at first cut, this is on some area you'd want to be experimental, that with respect to child care and health care both, market displacement might not be such a great idea, but to have market supplements would be a good idea. Now, exactly, I think America is, at least with respect to health care, in principle, committed to the notion of that everyone should have decent health care. I think most Americans believe that, and what scared them about the Clinton plan was it reminded, among the various problems with it, one of the problems that was either real or successfully suggested as real was its excessively bureaucratic and rigid and choice-denying character. But I think, if we could have, there are a million different models. I don't know, but by child care, do you mean care so that there's someone to take care of the child when the parent is working? Something like that. I don't know what kind of system would be best for that. I like the idea of trying to combine information and incentives, but and this I'm far from an expert on, but a lot of capitalist societies are committed to health care for everybody. And if you can put a man on the moon, chances are America can do that.
I think we'll take one more question so that Professor West and Sunstein will be here a fairly long time anyway with the book signing, so we can move to that phase of the program.
I'm honored to have the last question. I'd like to admit my bias first off too. I'm the chair of the Democratic Socialists of America here at the U of C. We're lucky to get the last two questions. My question is directed toward Mr. Sunstein primarily, though Mr. West can answer. I was wondering why the division between economic and political inequality, or economic democracy and political democracy. It seems that many of the decisions that are made in our lives are economic decisions, and they're made by people who aren't us. One quick example is that GM in the 1930s set out to destroy LA's trolley system and succeeded without the people of LA ever having a vote. I was just wondering why this division between economic democracy and political democracy.
Okay, I guess I should just say that I do not consider myself a socialist, never did. The socialism is not an ideal I endorse, given certain conceptions of what it means. If what socialism means is public ownership of the means of production, I think that is a recipe for economic disaster and democratic failure of the worst kind. So the socialist ideal of, which Marx back to Aristotle, of human flourishing, that's great. That's Roosevelt's ideal. And Johnson's too, and Dewey's. But I don't know when you say democratic socialist, I tell you my thought inside is, well, I want to be head of democratic capitalist. There's such an organization. But I don't even know if we disagree yet, because these terms, I think, have so much rhetorical energy, and it outruns maybe the practical disagreement. So I want to know what is it that a socialist considers himself or herself committed to. Economic equality, does that mean that everybody really has the same amount of money? Is that really what is that a good ideal, or public ownership of the means of production? I think we do much better to talk about specific things. Now, you are absolutely right that under conditions of widespread economic inequality, there are going to be problems of political inequality too. And what are we going to do about that? Well, that's a great question, and many people are working very hard on proposals that would reduce political inequality while also eliminating what seems to be the worst problem, which is people who are living lives of not quiet desperation. And you can do a lot of that without going toward economic equality, which I think is economic equality is a dangerous ideal and something that people should be frightened of and not happy about. But good, decent life prospects for everybody, or if what you mean by economic equality is floors for everybody and ceilings for everybody, well, floors, absolutely. Ceilings, probably. You have a consumption tax. Certainly a consumption ceiling, great. But I also think that the disagreement that you and I may have isn't a productive disagreement, in the sense that if I'm wrong on this, what kind of successful movement could we make, having shown that? I think probably democratic capitalists and democratic socialists, who I hope are not committed to public ownership of the means of production, and I hope when they say economic equality, they don't really mean that. I think then the distinction, when we can make lots of productive, we can really do something.
Yeah, can I just say one quick word about this debate about socialism? And as chair of one of the chairs of Democratic Socialists of America, I didn't know DSA was going to surface in this way. This is fascinating. I think it's very important to keep in mind when you talk about the legacy of a Eugene Debs or Norman Thomas or Dorothy Day or Michael Harrington or Martin Luther King Jr. or Barbara Ehrenreich or Gloria Steinem, all who consider themselves democratic socialists. It's clear that it's a tradition that has something in stark contrast to what the public mind in America means by socialism and communism. And I think it's important to note that none of them would call for absolute economic equality in the form of leveling So it's just a matter of somehow confiscating or appropriating the property of others. It's a call for egalitarian arrangement with the protection of rights and liberties that ensure the voices of working people at workplace, in our political institutions, and in our cultural institutions. Now, for me, that means, and Michael Harrington talks about this in his last work, he said, socialism is a name for a radical democratic desire that is always suspicious of capitalist markets that generate inequality, but knows that there's no blueprint for some other alternative without being built on the democratic elements and possibilities of what we have. And that's very important, because if in fact socialism becomes a term that trumps thinking, that stops critical reflection, then it easily puts persons in pigeonholes that makes it difficult to accept their insights. In the same way, the one would say, well, even democratic capitalists, well, what is that? Right? Pat Buchanan on the one hand, FDR on the other, they're both democratic capitalists, but they very different orientations. Why? Because they accent different elements. So that the question of how we use these labels and how we use these categories, I think, are very important if we're going to preserve this kind of, again, experimentalist impulse that is so very important. And I'm convinced that the democratic socialist tradition has so much to teach America. And at the same time, FDR has much to teach, even though he falls in traps as well, as do myself and others, and Pat Buchanan. God bless him. He's got a critique of corporate and bank elites that is worth listening to if he could just downplay some of that xenophobia and a lot of other things that he's got against gays and lesbians and so forth, you see. So I mean, it's a question of all of us trying to learn in part from each other so that certain categories somehow don't foreclose the conversation that we need to have, as we've had tonight.
I would like to thank everybody. Let's thank our two panelists.
It was very nice. And I think it's a nice service to the nation. You know what I mean?
Cornel West is a Harvard University professor. He's the author of Race Matters, The American Evasion of Philosophy, and The War Against Parents. Cass Sunstein is a professor in the University of Chicago's Political Science and Law departments. He's written Democracy.